Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jamille and I am the co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event in our Critical Conversations Environmental Humanities series. I would like to thank Professor Elizabeth Barrios, who's joining us today and whose work offers a rethinking of how Venezuelan literature, film, and criticism engage with the legacies of oil. I would also like to thank my co-organizer and colleague, Dr. Gianfranco Selgas, who is joining us from the University of Stockholm and Sweden, for his partnership in bringing this conversation to life. I would also like to thank Kathy Collins for her support behind the scenes, and of course to all of you for being here. This series is dedicated to fostering interdisciplinarity and transnational dialogues that advance environmental humanities research in its most expansive and engaged forms. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end, so do feel free to use the chat if you would like to pose a question. I will now hand over to Gianfranco, who will introduce Elizabeth in more detail. And again, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to the discussion. Gianfranco, over to you.
Thank you, Jamille. Appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. I'm just going to say a few words about Elizabeth and the talk, and then we just start and jump into it. So Elizabeth Barrios is an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures and chair of ethnic studies at Albion College in the US. Her research explores ecology, energy humanities, and Latin American and Latino literature and media. She's the author of Failures of the Imagination, Reckoning with Oil in Venezuelan Cultural Production, which is forthcoming with the University of Pittsburgh Press, and that's going to be the main topic of discussion today. And she's currently completing Plastic Environmentalisms, Petrocultures and Climate Denial in the Americas. She has been selected as fellow at the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University to complete this project during the 2025-2026 academic year. So in this talk, Elizabeth is going to examine how Venezuelan literature, film, and cultural criticism have reckoned with the social and ecological toll of oil, even as institutions and critics have often failed to acknowledge these works as truly about oil. Drawing from both canonical texts and overlooked archives, Elizabeth reveals how Venezuelan oil narratives have been systematically misread, miscategorized, or ignored, frequently by design. She advocates for new readings practices that re-situate Venezuelan cultural production within a planetary ecology of oil. With an interdisciplinary approach, bridging energy humanities, environmental studies, and Latin American culture analysis, the talk invites us to confront the narrative infrastructures of extractivism and to imagine forms of life that move beyond the logic of oil. So with that, Elisa, we're super excited to have you. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. If you give me 1 second here to set up my slide presentation. And okay, so you can see it, and let me make sure that here. Okay. Oh. I didn't mean to go to the next slide just yet. I'm working here between different files, what I'm reading, and then the slide deck. Okay, I think I'm all ready. So today I'll explore some of the myths of the oil industry to explain why it has taken so long for cultural institutions in Venezuela to grapple with the ecological impact of oil and petrochemical production. I'll be moving between personal anecdotes, historical case studies of industrial pollution, oil industry ads, and Venezuelan literature and criticism. And all of this is drawn from 4 different chapters of my forthcoming book, Failures of the Imagination. And I mixed all of this as a micro reflection of the book itself, which argues for the need for ways of reading that are attuned to the relationships among multiple contexts, temporalities, and scales, if we're going to make sense of the ecology of oil. So I will start with a personal anecdote. I had a teacher in elementary school in Venezuela who told our class that Venezuelan oil specifically did not pollute like it did in other countries, that it polluted a lot less. And I believed her because I was a child, right? And didn't really question this weird lesson as I grew up, as I immigrated, and then even as I became interested in ecology and climate change. I wasn't really questioning this idea. And then for years, I didn't know whether this was an offhand remark by the teacher herself or something that was part of the curriculum or an idea that was circulating nationally in the 1990s. I couldn't find precise evidence of anything in particular. But it was not until I learned the specifics of what happened to the former town of El Hornito. Now, let me make sure that the slides, yeah, there we go. And that's a picture of El Hornito. As it looked in 2023, meaning an empty field, right? And so it wasn't until I learned this history of what happened to that empty field that once held a town that it made a lot of sense to me how a Venezuelan schoolgirl in the 90s could be taught in school that Venezuelan oil does not pollute as much. And here I also include a map, right? Venezuela, Northern South America. And in the map, you see Lake Maracaibo, then the city of Maracaibo, and then El Tablazo across the lake from Maracaibo. And El Tablazo is where El Hornito used to be, right? El Hornito has disappeared from the map, and all you see is El Tablazo. And so what is El Tablazo? It's a petrochemical, or a complex, really, of petrochemical plants built in 1973, as you see in the map, across the city of Maracaibo. So built in 1973, and then by the late 70s, people of El Hornito began reporting that their plants were dying, that their domestic animals were getting sick and dying, and then people began getting sick as well. Cancer, birth defects, lung problems all cut the lives short of the people of El Hornito, which sparked a wave of environmental awareness in the region. And for years, residents and then as well as local communities, not exactly in El Hornito, were fighting to get the people of El Hornito relocated and compensated by Pequiven. And here's a picture of El Tablazo. I meant to show that earlier, but Pequiven is the Petroquímicas de Venezuela, or the state-owned company that runs the plant in Tablazo. Pequiven, in turn, responded with an aggressive PR campaign about the safety of the plant and also against the people of El Hornito. And I'm going to show a couple of examples. So to explain the dying plants and trees, a spokesperson for the wastewater treatment plant in El Tablazo claimed that, and I'll read in Spanish, and then you'll have the translation here. Ellos tienen la práctica común de quemar basura y el calor de esa quema les daña las matas. Then, to explain people's illnesses and the shortening lifespan of the town, a doctor working for Pequiven claimed, es una población semirural y sus habitantes tienen la costumbre de andar descalzos, lo que es fuente viva de enfermedades parasitarias. And we will return to these quotes later in the presentation, but for now, I will just tell you how the story ended. The government ignored El Hornito's situation until February 1990, when an explosion exposed the plant's failure to meet safety and environmental standards. Within a month, Pequiven was forced to agree to the town's relocation and to pay for their new houses, but not for their medical treatments. The site of the old El Hornito was completely demolished by Pequiven, hence the empty field I showed at the beginning. And then medical and environmental research on the subject of what happened in El Hornito was more or less banned. The situation I have described might give us the impression of a malfunctioning oil industry and petrostate, right? It's riddled with misinformation, corruption, industrial accidents, and disregard for human and non-human life. But what I have described is not an aberration. It is closer to the status quo of most oil-producing societies, especially when it comes to marginal communities where petrochemical plants tend to get built. And all of this is ultimately the logical outcome of, I'm going to change slides, particular ways of seeing necessary to establish and to naturalize an oil economy. Right? These are ways of seeing that have greatly shaped Venezuelan culture and institutions for over a century. And these ways of seeing depend on at least 3 oil industry myths, which I will spend the rest of this presentation exploring. So the first myth is oil production, be it the extraction of it or the petrochemical plants that turn oil into all kinds of commodities, takes place in no particular place. When it comes to the building of the petrochemical plant El Tablazo, this myth is quite literally written into law. The government decree that authorized the building of the plant in 1966 does not mention the existence of El Hornito. Instead, it describes the area as an empty terrain named El Tablazo. The inexistence of El Hornito was thus written into a national decree, while its inhabitants were not informed of what had happened or what was to come. And so 2 years later, on 1 October morning in 1968, the National Guard showed up and told half the town's inhabitants that they were being evicted. They were given 1 day, one single day, to move all of their possessions and a nominal fee to rebuild their houses. And since they weren't warned about the dangers of living next to a petrochemical plant, most of them built their homes within the traditional boundaries of El Hornito, meaning right by where the plant was going to be built. And there's no official record of this eviction. All that remains are a series of interviews carried out by a team headed by Professor Jorge Inestrosa in the Universidad del Zulia. And they did these interviews after the fact and transcribed them. And that's all that remains of this story. And so again, by law and documentation, El Hornito was rendered into non-existence once it was determined that it was going to be the site of a petrochemical plant. The sense that the oil economy and its extractive processes happen or take place in no real place has been a recurring preoccupation in a small group of Venezuelan novels from oil-producing regions in the country. These works capture what it's like to be reduced to nothing but oil, to be flattened on the map, and to live alongside the consequences. For instance, Ramon Diaz Sanchez's Mene, published in 1936, in that novel, there is a representative from a US company who is touring the eastern shores of Lake Maracaibo, so the same region where El Hornito is located. And his tour guide explains in great detail the history of the area, the description itself of the passage has all this very detailed information of the environment. And at the end of the tour, we get the impression of the representative, right? After all of this description of all these details, he sums up what he saw. And I'll read it in Spanish. And for those of you who understand Spanish, it's going to be grammatically incorrect because it's supposed to reflect the way that the representative is speaking. So I'm going to cite now. Todo esto ser petróleo, todo esto. Basta viendo este montecito es el petróleo que no dejándolo crecer. In his remark, he conveys how he did not manage to really see anything. Right? He saw nothing in the tour because this place is not really a place for him, right? It's only oil. Changing pages. So literary texts like Mene attempted to give narrative shape to this experience of a place being reduced to nothing but oil to the outside world. Yet this attempt to make sense of this experience has more often than not been disregarded in Venezuelan cultural and literary institutions. And I will cite just one essay as representative of other kind of critical analyses of this type of literature. And so this is by historian Manuel Caballero, who argues that one of the central weaknesses of Venezuelan oil literature is the fact that these texts seem to have little to do with the rest of Venezuelan society because they take place in una tierra que nada tiene que ver con la propia. Nada que ver con la Venezuela que sus autores siempre han conocido como la suya. Es un país extranjero donde domina el diablo. Yet, if we take the experiences of El Hornito seriously, a site that quite literally got written out of existence within Venezuela by law and then polluted out of existence materially by a petrochemical plant, then we should entertain the idea that this distance between the experience of oil production sites and the rest of Venezuela, right, the sense of foreignness, might have very well been the point of these literary texts. In his argument, Caballero is implying that the sites and the narratives that emerge from them have nothing to do with him, with Venezuela, and perhaps with us, wherever we are. And so Caballero's argument ultimately exemplifies the ways in which a lot of 20th century intelligentsia of the oil world internalized the myths of the oil economy, even as they were trying to be critical of the oil economy, right? Because they retained that sense of being detached from the sites, the processes, and the consequences of oil production. In the rest of Caballero's essay, he argues that to truly understand oil, we need to instead explore all the things that oil made possible for the average Venezuelan, which sure, but understanding that doesn't really cancel out stories like that of El Hornito or of that literature that I've alluded to. We can see a similar state of denial as that of Caballero in the thinking of Arturo Slapietri, who's likely one of the most influential thinkers of oil in Venezuela. And he wrote a novel with the title Estación de Máscaras in 1964, which has this to say about what it would really mean to write a Venezuelan oil novel. And here's the quote. Pozos, cabrias y tubos negros de oleoductos hay en muchas partes. En Texas, en Kuwait, en Rumania, en Irán. Lo que es nuestro no es eso, sino el eco, el reflejo, la emoción del petróleo en nosotros. In other words, in order to understand oil's imprint in Venezuela, we must focus on specific subjective experiences apart from the processes and infrastructure of oil production, because those are the same everywhere. So he is again encouraging us to imagine oil production as occurring in no particular place, because place implies specificity. I will now quote another passage from the same scene and the same novel that encapsulates some of the conceptual roots of this disregard of the material elements of oil production. Naturaleza hay en todas partes y se parece. Lo que no se parece es el hombre. La selva del Congo y la nuestra se parecen, pero en cambio los hombres de allá y los de aquí somos distintos. The assertion that two of the most biodiverse but also fast disappearing regions in the world, Congolese and Amazonian jungles, are more or less the same is by itself ghastly enough. However, I am highlighting this passage because it embodies a vision of the world necessary for the myths of the oil industry, and a view of nature as an inert realm external to society. As such, nature becomes the object for human management and domination. From the vantage point described so far, to tell the story of oil is to tell the story of individuals, of their thoughts, of their feelings, and not of infrastructure, and certainly not that of ecosystems, let alone of the planet. And this takes us to the second myth that helps explain why many Venezuelans, like me as a child, might have come to implicitly believe that Venezuelan oil did not pollute as much, which is oil at last gave us, society, modern society, power over nature itself. Oil is not just gasoline and energy. Thanks to the petrochemical revolution that began unfolding during the First World War, oil derivatives can and have infiltrated every area of production. This drastically shifted how many humans and institutions came to imagine their futures. For instance, in a meeting about resource depletion in 1926, mining engineers warned about the possibility of depletion of key minerals. Chemists, however, disregarded these concerns, arguing that new synthetic materials, meaning petrochemicals, would make it possible to create any resource that ran short by artificial means. Possessing a different set of interests and expertise, the United States Foreign Relations Committee published a report claiming that synthetics, again meaning petrochemicals, may in the reasonably near future make the production of coffee, cocoa, cotton, sugar, wool, and some other farm commodities unnecessary. And in the end, I find that visual examples best illustrate these points and the mindset of much of the expertise of the mid-20th century. So here you see an ad for Shell Oil from 1957 called Climate in a Cage. And of course, with our 21st century eyes, it's usually would probably think about anthropogenic climate change when we see an oil company's ad with this title and with this image. But in the ad, what they're actually doing is explaining the so-called green revolution, or the use of petrochemicals to create synthesized fertilizers, which overcame previous limits to land and agricultural yields. In that the expansion of the human population from 1.6 to 8 billion would not have been possible without the amount of food that became available thanks to synthetic ammonia, which is a petrochemical. So in short, from transportation to food production and the manufacturing of most commodities, oil transformed the material conditions of most human societies. And this material context is what's most often forgotten when we talk about oil in the Venezuelan context. The oil industry's myth about being able to manipulate earthly conditions, visually represented on screen right now, right, without needing to really pay attention to the consequences, were particularly effective because they relied on one of modernity's conceptual pillars, which I mean the separation of humanity and nature. And I bring this up to highlight that the oil industry did not create a brand new way of seeing the world. It was ultimately simply intensifying and expanding ideas that were centuries in the making. So this belief that societies had at last gained power over the planet, over nature, over materials, over geography, became a basic premise, not just of corporate, corporate research and development, or in economic and political policy, like the examples I brought up before, but also in cultural production and in the imagination, although not always explicitly acknowledged as such. This is ultimately a view of the world that emphasizes human, and even more specifically, individual mastery and freedom, especially freedom of movement. It also encourages us to see humans as existing apart from non-human contexts, from long-term processes, and from collectives. And within this worldview, it became easier to claim that the people of El Hornito were sick because of their own choices, not because of long-term exposure to invisible chemicals. And so if scientists could cage the climate, as we see on the screen right now, then why wouldn't they also be able to keep petrochemicals from polluting, right? Kiven's own PR campaign in the 80s and 90s made that claim over and over again, that their plant was not polluting the region, was not polluting Lake Maracaibo. They reassured the public that their technology was advanced enough to make sure that pollution wouldn't happen. And then, given this larger context of the powers that the oil and petrochemical industries were supposed to have, why would people doubt these reassurances in the 1990s when Venezuelans, like much of the world, had been told these types of stories for generations? And then also, once pollution became undeniable, why would people doubt that science could simply geoengineer a solution? Right? So this takes us to the third myth. The oil industry is scientific and rational, and people living near its operations are uneducated and irrational. Let us anchor this section by repeating the quotes that I brought up at the beginning of this presentation, right? Talking about the hormiteros, ellos tienen la práctica común de quemar basura y el calor de esa quema les daña las matas. Es una población semirural y sus habitantes tienen la costumbre de andar descalzos, lo que es fuente viva de enfermedades parasitarias. According to these experts, the people of El Hornito are themselves individually or as a community to blame for their own predicament. The fact that they blame the petrochemical industry for their ills is symptomatic of their backwardness, their inability to understand science, technology, and to accept modernity. The oil industry in Venezuela, while often depicted as violent, as corrupt, and as all kinds of bad things, does tend to get depicted as nonetheless rational and technological, at least historically. And returning to Manuel Caballero's quote, the critic that I've been using as the representative here, he claims that by depicting the horrors of oil production, novels like Mene and the whole tradition of Venezuelan oil literature, these texts display una actitud profundamente reaccionaria que reacciona contra la modernidad. He then encourages Venezuelans to stop demonizing the oil business and to instead learn to see the oil industry as an industry like any other, ni más ni menos diabólica que cualquier otra manera de hacer dinero. And I don't have time to fully unpack this idea, and you can read my book in 2026 for that, but the oil business is not just any business. It is the bedrock of the global economy. It is a decisive factor in creating the conditions for an ecological crisis of planetary proportions, and it is the center of a coordinated attempt to delay action to ameliorate the causes of climate change. So what we're seeing here in the screen with these quotes is that third myth. The oil industry is ultimately just rationally trying to make money. It might have all these problems, but it's just a rational industry, right? And so those novelists that wrote about it and all its problems were simply against progress. And then again, with these ideas circulating for decades, we can make a quick jump to saying similar things about the people of El Hornito. Another pertinent example of this idea, of this myth, comes again from Arturo Sarpietri's same novel, Extracción de Máscaras, in the novel's own description of what a true Venezuelan oil novel would look like, right? In opposition to the actual existing oil novels in the country. So in this ideal unwritten novel, the material realities of extraction wouldn't really be part of it, but instead, what would be depicted is la noción mágica de la realidad que el petróleo ha despertado en nosotros. Such a novel would focus on an immaterial Venezuelan psyche, taking the form of una especie de epopeya primitiva that manages to convey todo este delirio que los posee, ser ricos sin trabajo, alcanzar todo sin esfuerzo, la sensación de poderse topar en cualquier desván con una lámpara de Aladino. In this passage, we see how oil creates the illusion that prosperity can emerge as if by magic. And that sensation is attributed to a Venezuelan, specifically Venezuelan mindset. And the word choice in this regard is important, right? Delirium, best encapsulated by a primitive epic. And all of this implies that pre-modern irrationality at the heart of Venezuelan society as it stumbled upon oil. And I don't dispute that the passage is describing a form of delirium tied to oil, but what I think it gets wrong is the attributing it to Venezuelans, right? And to say that this is a primitive epic, because this epic is thoroughly modern and it's global. These musings about Venezuelan society describe the same myth down to the central metaphor portrayed in a science documentary from the United States, financed by Shell Oil and shown in mid-century schools in the United States. And the title of the documentary is very convenient for me and my argument because it's Oils for Aladdin's Lamp. And I'm going to show you a clip from the documentary. Well, first, just an image here of the title at the beginning, text at the beginning. But since Aladdin's time, science has set us straight about miracles. We know today that the true genie of the lamp was the oil that provided its light. And now I'm going to jump to the short clip. I hope you can all hear it.
Yes, day in and day out, the men of the laboratory work on, experimenting, testing, discovering. And the fruits of their labors are more wonderful, more practical than anything Aladdin ever produced with his fabulous lamp. The scientist creates his product with petroleum or natural gas. By shifting and rearranging the molecular structure, he creates new material, replaces old and scarce material, finds useful substances never before known to exist. It's all based on the soundest scientific reasoning, on formulas and more formulas.
I love that, formulas and more formulas. And so the documentary is educating us on the ways that petrochemicals allow modern life to be more fantastical than myth, as they enable the sudden and effortless appearance of all kinds of things. And remembering this mid-century rhetoric and the fact that this was circulating in schools should help us understand the goal to be rich without labor, or that la sensación de poderse topar en cualquier desván con una lámpara de Aladino, described by Usar Pietri as a Venezuelan phenomenon, is actually a central conceit of transnational oil and petrochemical industries themselves. These are industries that owe much of their power to their ability to generate as much wealth as possible with as little labor as possible. Yet depicting only one group of people, Venezuelans, as magical thinkers, and ignoring how this too might describe the oil and petrochemical industries, ultimately reproduces a pre-existing myth, which is that of the pre-modern peoples living in the tropics in need of proper instruction and civilization. This dark-skinned magical thinker helps cast all opposition to extraction as unserious mysticism, standing in stark contrast to a rational science-based industry as we see in this ad for Mobil Gas. In this presentation, I try to explore oil's imprint on the imagination, selling fantastical dreams that for much of the 20th century were confused with reality, with policy, with technology. This larger context is meant to explain why many critics claim that works showing the dangers of oil didn't really reflect Venezuelan reality in the 20th century. We see all of this reflected in one of the only few accounts of what happened in El Hornito, the documentary Nuestro Petróleo y Otros Cuentos, released in 2005, a film that was incredibly controversial when it was released. And one of its critics, writing for a publication that called itself socialist, argued that the film was an utter failure because it focused too much on the mystery of oil, instead that showing the true Venezuelan, the real flesh and bone Venezuela, la Venezuela de carne y hueso. According to this review, the film, by depicting El Hornito, along with other sites victimized by environmental violence, failed because the documentary didn't show, the documentary doesn't show that makes the most reference to what PDVSA's oil is making possible. In my quote here, I had mixed the English and the Spanish and I got confused. So once again, here, as we're concluding, we're seeing the same conceptual maneuver of Caballero and Usar Pietri, right? An idea that I think would piss all of them off because they all have very different ideological agendas, but they're all being brought together here because they're implying that there is a real Venezuela, the one they inhabit, which has nothing to do with the destruction, displacement, and pollution caused by oil and petrochemical production. These are harms that affect someone else, happening somewhere else, in no place of real consequence. And so while all of these people are critics of the oil economy, everyone I've cited here alleges to critique the oil economy, they're nonetheless still enchanted by the myths of the oil economy. Because they're taking its myth at face value. And how could they not, right? So many of us, myself included, as I mentioned at the beginning, were educated not to see oil's impact, right? And Oil for Aladdin's Lamp was an educational film. And so to break out of the oil economy's hold in our thinking and our imagination, we must allow ourselves to be disturbed by the hidden entanglements of our lives with oil production and its detritus. We must let stories like that of El Hornito help reshape the ways we imagine what it means to be a community, a nation, and an oil-consuming human. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to also, beyond the Q&A, you feel free to email me.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was so rich, so compelling, so generous. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you now about your work. Just to kick off the conversation, well, one of the fascinating aspects that you presented on is this like visual rhetoric and language, as well the lexicon of the industry. And I find it fascinating, to how we are able to read this corporate petrovisuals with the students, to read against those petrovisuals. And I think that would relate to my first question to you. If you could maybe expand on the alternative vocabularies and that you mobilize in the classroom to help unlearn these myths. And I guess, and this also relates to teaching in the US context specifically about this ecology of oil and working through different contexts, North America, South America, and there seems to be the need to for comparison, but at the same time the need for specificity. And I was wondering, like, if you could expand on which aspects of your methodology travel well across those two contexts and across different oil geographies. So yeah, first one about visual rhetorics, and then the second one about working in comparison and working with specificity as well. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. So I use those images, the corporate images, in my classes. In one in particular, so I have been kind of fascinated by oil ads because they're so messed up, and they historically show. I don't know, yeah, the ideologies of the moment right now. If you look at advertisements of oil companies, they all seem to be in the business of green energy and have nothing to do with oil. But the historical ones are so optimistic. And so, like, we're going to create essentially this utopia. And I found it. So I now have been collecting them for years, and used to have like a Google Drive, and now it's a Pinterest board with all of these images. And in one of my classes, I have students, as their midterm, go through all of those images and then explain how they're exemplifying some of the readings from earlier in the semester about like the idea of nature being separate from humanity, the way that like nature isn't really part of history, right? But what I've found, despite myself, it's never been my plan, and I still haven't found a way to integrate it into the curriculum, is that a lot of these ads have animals, and very, very cute animals, and students are fascinated by that. Like, why are all of these oil companies throughout, since the 40s and to today, that have pictures of kittens or of turtles, and sometimes in contexts that have nothing to do with oil. And kind of what that a lot of the classes have landed on as part of the discussion is that it naturalizes oil, right? That you're not really seeing anything related to oil. You're just seeing this beautiful seal on the beach, or you're seeing a little kitten sleeping, and it's just like oil is just part of this. And it's hard to teach about Latin America and environmental issues in Latin America and the United States, partially because if the class is going to have a Latin American focus, there's so much remedial information that's needed, and it's getting worse, right? Things like actually identifying the countries in the map. 10 years ago, usually you could expect a college student in the US to be able to do that, and now most can't. So we have to spend time going over the map, going over very, very basic information, that it's gotten harder to be able to do both, right? Or to be able to have conversations about the environment that doesn't completely exoticize Latin America. So that's currently a challenge. So an imperfect solution has been that, unfortunately, in the last couple of years, I've separated these topics. I have my Latin American classes that maybe have a little thing on the environment, and then have my environmental classes where we mostly focus in the US. And students, generally, if they're going to take an environmental humanities class in the US, they already agree with a lot of the information. And especially since last year in the election, when I taught, actually, the challenge became I have to explain that that oil companies aren't just inherently evil, right? Because I think what happened several times during the semester is that students were like, well, of course they do that because they're evil, right? And that became also a way to not actually think about like, well, what are the mindsets that led to this? So it was a weird moment of me saying like, guys, let's not talk about how evil they are. Let's get at it in a different way. I don't know if I've answered all of your questions, got lost here a little bit in the teaching question.
Yeah, absolutely. Gianfranco, would you like to jump in as well?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Elisa. It's always a pleasure to listen to you and to know more about your work. I just want to go back to the material. I mean, the archives you work with, all the different works you discuss in the book, and I guess maybe the difficulty in a way to access to some of these materials that are not available. For example, in the U.S., based in the U.S., it's not easy to get hold to these materials. So can you describe a little bit the process of, finding this material, dealing with it, systematizing all the information, and then just producing this amazing book?
Yeah, definitely a challenge. And I think most notably when it comes to El Hornito, essentially to get materials from Venezuela, it required knowing someone in Venezuela who was willing to help me out, because I couldn't really rely on Venezuelan institutions to help or to be able to help to have the materials. So I can give like a precise example with El Hornito. So most of this information that I'm citing came from a study carried out by Jorge Nestroza, who was now retired, but a professor in the Universidad del Zulia, who for like nearly 30 years was carrying out different forms of research related to El Hornito, getting teams of activists and researchers to try to preserve this information. And between people immigrating and his own like economic and essentially economic situation worsened, most of his materials got lost. Like he just doesn't know where it is. Like, Fulanito de Tal had some of the stuff and then they left the country and they said to find the boxes here and then they weren't there anymore. And then, so a lot of it just came from his own notes, right? Like, and it's something I do address in the book of the challenges of carrying out research in Venezuela, but Venezuela in this case is representative of countries that have experienced some kind of social collapse and of communities that, right, like El Hornito didn't have its own archive. I mean, the town got destroyed, right? So I had to rely on the notes and the documents, like what he had on PDF from 20, 30 years ago. And that's why for example, he describes pamphlets by Pequiven, like one, the title was La Petroquímica no contamina el lago, the petrochemical plant does not pollute the lake. But I just took his word for it, right? Because he couldn't find the document. I couldn't find it. I wouldn't know where to find it. I don't feel safe going to Pequiven and asking them for it because I also go to Venezuela frequently. And so it just truly does not feel safe. And so, that probably leads to a project that's less precise than it could be, right? That I can't show you that. I can't even prove to you that pamphlet existed. I'm trusting on the secondhand account of the researcher. But the alternative is then to not tell the story because I can't find the documents, right? And I think a lot of us working in Venezuela are facing kind of similar situations. But I also do, in the book, explicitly bring up ads from the United States, and I examine Oil for Aladdin's Lamp to make that point, that it's not that Venezuelans were just like magical thinkers that couldn't handle oil. I'm saying like nobody could handle oil. That even in the United States and like the techno-scientific language of the United States was also full of all these fantasies about what oil would accomplish.
Yes, we have some questions. Yeah, Gianfranco, do you
yeah. No, I have more questions, but I think we have great questions here. It'd be awesome to address them as well. I don't know if maybe we can just read some and then we just go back to other questions. What do you think?
Yes, Jen Long, right? Thanks you for your presentation and asks if you could outline the connections you found between your research in Venezuela and disillusionment in the US. So that's the first one.
Try to understand Venezuela and now disillusionment in the US, like disillusionment about the kind of the oil economy and all of these promises. If I understand that correctly, I mean, right now, what we're seeing politically in the United States is this doubling down on gas and oil, and I mean the oil industry is lobbying pretty hard in the current administration. And interestingly, like I try not to listen to Donald Trump very frequently, but I do follow some energy news and end up hearing some of what he has to say. And it's not that dissimilar from the kind of all of this technology will be enough, right? Like that kind of techno-scientific kind of magical thinking that I don't think comes from Trump himself, but from whatever it is being told by the oil industry. The U.S. is also so divided, right? Like very obviously so now, maybe in ways that 10 years ago it wasn't quite as obvious, but there's a sense of being a society in decline. And one of the ways that one political side of the divide right now, part of that not being in decline anymore and returning to some golden age is through oil, right, and through fracking and through like doubling down on the carbon economy. Yeah, I want to make sure there's other questions here.
Yes. Karina's question, which has to do with ethics, representation, and Irene's is about patrinational identity. So maybe the first one.
Maybe I can read it out loud and then
Yes.
I conduct ethnographic fieldwork in an oil spill affected area in India. In the early days of research, one of my respondents was an elderly lady who recalled the early days of the oil company. Her memory was of the oil machines reflected into her eyes through the trees, something that I found interesting. She lives in an indigenous landscape and didn't know much about the company when it came, but she was fascinated by it and did pique her curiosity. She didn't know the details around it because it was a new industry. So I am wondering how I could represent this anecdote best without patronizing her or glorifying this time of her memory as a filmmaker researcher. Would you have thoughts on this? How do we separate the emotion from the interpretation of the story as we write or make media around it? Yeah, that's fascinating because what I found in reading both fiction and nonfiction of that moment when people first encounter oil infrastructure is this like spectacular, as in terms of like spectacle, like thing that like is transforming the landscape in ways that is both fascinating and horrifying at the same time. And so a way to not be patronizing about it might be to see it systemically, right? In a lot, I mean, my sources are literary because in the end I'm rooted in literary studies, but not just Venezuelan novels. Only one has been translated. It would be Mene, which is also part of why I included here. It's the one that could carry across contexts, but something that the novel itself describes that, right? It talks about this vegetación fantástica, this fantastical vegetation that suddenly takes over the landscape. But then other novels, Oil on Water by Habila, Enon Habila from Nigeria, Greenvow, I think it's pronounced, by George Mackay in Scotland. Cities of Salt by Munif, Abdelrahman Munif, that all of them have in common this description, like very similar to what you just said there. And one of the things that I argue, and it's not just me, other people too, Graham McDonald, Jennifer Wenzel, talk about this kind of repeated story or this repeated experience that people have in many places when they encounter this infrastructure, because it really does change the landscape, right? It really changes people's experiences. So seeing it as systemic, something that's repeated, something that's global, and it's also specific, and it's also particular, and it's also about that woman and what she lived. I think bringing those two things together might be a way to handle that. That would be my recommendation. And I'm more than happy to talk about this. I could talk about it for hours. Left my email there. You can email me and we can talk. And I'll read the next.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So I'm really whoops, it just moved for me. I'm really interested in how oil shapes national identity in petrostates in the Middle East. Oil is often linked to anti-imperial struggles. Nationalizing oil usually meant gaining control over oil production and asserting national sovereignty. Do you see a similar different rhetoric in Venezuela? 100%, like 100%, right? The nationalizing oil, if anything, one of the things I talk about in the book is that how hard it was for artists or writers to write about the problems with oil after nationalization, because now it's the nation, now it's part of us. And even now the motto of PDVSA, the state oil company, is like, now PDVSA belongs to everyone, right? That it's like, it's part of us. And to be against PDVSA is to be against the nation, to be against yourself. And so that really helps greenwash the oil industry. And that my second project that I'm working on right now is about that, the problems with like oil nationalism. Yeah, absolutely listen in Venezuela.
Yeah, if I may jump in right there, Elizabeth, because that's a great question. And I was going to ask you if in the material you work with, you see some sort of line drawn after nationalization, the way people deal. I mean, at least these culture critics and historians and scientists deal with the idea of the oil industry in Venezuela, right? Because before nationalization, you have the oil industry as this transnational company, right, that is established on Venezuelan soil and is basically detached, right, from beyond the oil camps and all of these Tinker Salas addresses very well. You have this disconnection, right, with the oil industry, and then it comes all this narrative of el petróleo es nuestro, el petróleo es del pueblo, etc., right, which is important. Do you see anything? I mean, did you see something like that in addressing the different type of media you work with?
What I saw was silence, right? That like the types of critiques that were pretty common up to the mid 60s, silence, right? Until after like 1983, after the Venezuelan economy collapses, it's first when it collapses, start seeing a little more, but it's striking how much more rich the discourse about the problems with oil were prior to nationalization. And then just like there's just this lull, and I think it's part of believing of that rhetoric, right? Of just like it's ours, and it's now it's what makes us prosperous, right? And I understand that if you're a Venezuelan in the 1970s, you're an old Venezuelan in the 1970s who can remember the 1910s and 1920s. That's very seductive to believe that this is here to make our society better. So I see some more. I want to make sure I get to.
Yes, Miguel.
Miguel's question. Yeah.
In terms of bibliography, which Venezuelan figures, aside from Coronil, right, have shaped your thinking about oil and culture?
Venezuelan figures. I mean, really a lot of the cultural producers themselves. So Milagros Mata Gil, who's a novelist, who's still alive. I think one of the few who's still alive from earlier oil novels, who wrote this novel in 1989, Memorias de una antigua primavera, Memories of an Old Spring. Like when I read it, it blew my mind. I was still in grad school, and it like really cemented like, oh, this is what I want to study. This is what I'm going to be doing. Just because of its very complex questioning of nationalism, of oil, and then what it does to our locality. I mean, I think really the novels themselves had an impact. Like I wasn't supposed to be the public, if we believe the old critical consensus that these are not novels about Venezuela and they're so antiquated, and there's also all these criticisms for them being social realist and that's so old hat. And I'm in Michigan in the 2010s reading the stuff and finding it extremely compelling. And I do think that they spoke better to a generation of people who were experiencing, or from afar, in my case, the collapse of Venezuela, and then an awareness of like the environmental problems of oil. I think those of us who were grappling with that were maybe more ready to read these novels and take them seriously than someone in the 70s who's seeing all this like prosperity that oil made possible. So, I mean, the art itself, Rafael Uzcategui, a human rights activist, he ran an anarchist newspaper in Venezuela, has had a profound impact on my thinking too. Because I mean, when I first read his work, it felt like finally someone I agreed with about Venezuela, in that it was a leftist critique of the Venezuelan state, and I just wasn't seeing that reflected anywhere, right? The problems with having this petro state carry out a socialist revolution, and I think a lot of what he was saying in the 2000s, 2010s came out to be true. Unfortunately, he was right. And
so I think we read the questions from the chat. I could just continue talking about, your work, Elizabeth, and asking other questions. And I'm sure Gianfranco is the same. I'm conscious of time, though. I don't know if Gianfranco would like to ask another question in our remaining time, or...
Yeah, I mean, we can take 2 minutes to ask Elizabeth to say something about the new project. About plastics. If you can say something very, very quick. We know we have just a couple of minutes. Thank you, Elizabeth.
It's I think the book that I wanted to write as I was writing this one, and still just didn't have the full concept of it. But conceptually speaking, is about how the oil economy, including petrochemicals, including plastics, really benefit from all of us seeing nature in aesthetic terms, right? Like oil companies fund parts all the time, right? And to have this vision of nature as unchanging, and therefore to expect things to be unchanging, therefore the climate doesn't change. But the other side of that, to expect plastics, essentially, which is this material made from petrochemicals that doesn't degrade easily. So that there's this drive towards an aesthetics of like immortality, lack of change, and how a lot of that is part of the greenwashing that the oil industry does as well. So it's also a critique of like Venezuelan state company and Colombia's and Peru's.
Wow, I look forward to continuing to following your work, and thank you so much, Elizabeth. Just wish you the best of luck with the continuation of this project. And thank you, Gianfranco, for our partnership. It's always exciting to be in conversation with you. And we would also like to thank everyone who joined the conversation and asked questions. And any final words, Elizabeth, Gianfranco?
I just want to thank the two of you for organizing this and having me here. I'm very happy to have a chance to do this. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Just thank you. This was great.
Thank you. I just want to say that we have one more talk scheduled for October 8th. I'm just going to share the link over here so you guys can check it out. It's with Ståle Holgersen, a geographer from Stockholm University, discussing about the term crisis and what crisis means. So we look forward to having you all. And thank you again, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jamille. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Gracias.